Hello, hello.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going well. Let's see. Joe, is Jill joining too, or just you?
Just me.
Okay, no problem. Just curious. Hello, Heath. I see your mouth. I know you're saying hello, but I can't hear you.
How about now?
Yeah, now I hear you.
Okay.
So I know of two that will not make it today, or Ben Wheeler most likely will not be able to make it. And then Dave Carbonneau is all no. So hopefully we'll have the rest of the group, but we shall see.
I realized I had not sent Sean the Zoom link for the meeting, and just now sent it to him, so he'll be joining in a second.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I guess that slipped my mind as well for some reason.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you for doing
Sean,
that.
as in Mayor Sean?
No, Sean, our guest presenter.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh.
All right. We'll just wait, I think, until 5 after and then get started. Welcome to Superintendent Carpenter and Sean from DLCD.
Hi, everybody.
Hi there. I feel like the headset adds to the official. I need to get one.
This is the official DLCD headset.
Yeah, yeah.
As does your background, Matt. Very nice.
What? Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm hovering over Estacada.
That's right. You're sitting up above.
That's right.
Love.
So I'll share the agenda again up here. I'll probably be screen sharing different things, but if you have your email that I sent out that has everything that we will be reviewing today, except for Sean's presentation. But everything else that we're going to look at will be in that email. Sean, did you want to share your screen when it comes time, or would you prefer that I run your slides on my side?
I would love to share screen. I do have a question, though. I see on the agenda, it says I'm talking about housing production strategies. Did you guys also want to talk about House Bill 2001 and House Bill 2003, or do you want to just focus on housing production strategies?
Well, yeah, fair question. I mean, So those, as I understand it, and I may be incorrect, those don't necessarily apply to us, right? Those House
That's
bills?
what I was, that's what I was gonna bring up, Matt, is that 2001, we don't qualify, or we're not a part of that because we're too small.
Yeah, and so same with housing production strategies, actually. I think with all of these, I'm actually not going to be talking about the requirements so much as the concepts behind them.
Yeah. So I think conceptually, let's go ahead and do it. Maybe
Okay.
just not do a deep dive.
Yeah, sure.
Because even though we're not legally required to follow those, we're still trying to, where possible, sort of incorporate the intent of those. So it's good to just kind of brush up.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah, and that's what I'll be talking about is none of the requirements, but just like what's the idea behind middle housing?
Okay, got it. All right, I'm not seeing anyone else entering the waiting room right now. So I think we'll go ahead and just jump in then. Let me take the agenda down for a moment so we can see one another. So I will note that the time is 2:37 p.m. on the 11th of May, 2021. And I have done this in our other meetings. I will quickly do it again, just for the sake of, I think, Sean, but also just everyone brushing up. We have a specific charge from the city council, and that is to make recommendations to them. We are making some decisions about what goes into those recommendations, but ultimately the council is going to decide what to do with those recommendations. So this Committee on Housing Affordability and Diversity specifically is meant to identify relevant issues, barriers, and opportunities relating to affordable housing in the city. To B, provide recommendations to the council and staff to meet the variety of housing affordability needs in the city. And C, and Taylor, I'll have you touch on this later in the meeting, assess progress toward meeting housing needs identified in the city's forthcoming housing needs analysis. So that's kind of why we're here. Keep that in mind. And with that, let's quickly do a round of just kind of who we are. Again, that may be for Sean more than anyone, since we've all seen each other a couple of times now, but I'll start and then I'll pass it to someone else. And then for whoever I call on, if you want to do the same thing. My name is Matt Lorenzen. I'm the city's economic development manager. And traditionally that doesn't always have a lot to do directly with housing, but in our case, the workforce and housing are interconnected issues, and I suspect that's the case everywhere. And so since we wear many hats as a small staff at City Hall, I'm getting involved here. I will call on Taylor next.
Hi, thank you, and sorry that I missed a few minutes there. I had to take a phone call. I'm Taylor Campy. I'm the city planner, and are we explaining sort of our connection with our roles to
No,
the
I
housing
don't think so.
issues?
You can just say you deal with all things land use in Estacada, and that's probably good
Yep.
enough.
Which involves housing. And I will also mention that, as at least Katie and Matt know, last night the city council did approve the city's entry into a contract to have a housing needs analysis and housing strategy project completed for the city. So we'll be getting started on that soon. And I think that this committee's recommendations and conversations will hopefully be, some synergy there. So that's exciting.
Thank
right.
you.
And I'll call on Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie Dunsmuir. I am a city councilor for Estacada, and Housing has been the main focus for me during the entire time I've been on the council, mostly because that's what I do as a profession. I am an apartment manager, and I have managed everything from small mom and pop apartments to currently I'm managing a nice, big, beautiful apartment community in Sandy that's got all the bells and whistles of amenities that you could imagine. But my studio apartments also start renting at $1,230 per month. And that's, to me, very unaffordable, and kind of goes against what a lot of my focus has been for housing affordability over the last several years. So that being said, I appreciate every one of you guys being here. I'm really excited to see what we can all do collectively between the city council and this board and the housing needs analysis. And just as a team, let's make Estacada a really great place to live and work and play. So thank you for all for being here, and I'm going to call on Ryan.
All right, thank you very much. And it was a pleasure to watch the city council meeting yesterday. You guys did a great job. You're a cohesive team and had great dialogue there. So really great job. My name is Ryan Carpenter, and I currently serve as the superintendent for Estacada Schools. I'll call on my good friend, Coach Heath Stalkup.
My name is Heath Stalkup. I'm a long-term resident of Estacada and property owner, business owner, and land developer. And have several rentals in the Estacada area. And I will call on, is Deborah Bufton here?
She is.
I am, thank you. Hi,
Yep.
I'm Deborah. Oops, I can video for just a minute. I'm eating my lunch, so I'm gonna keep my video off. I'm Deborah Bufton. I'm the executive director of the Estacada Area Food Bank, and I will call on Joe.
Hi, everyone, Joe Vaness. I work with the Housing Authority of Clackamas County. My current role, I am in charge of asset management. So I oversee our 1,000 or so units of housing that we have, both public housing and affordable housing. And I also work closely with our development team when they're doing new projects and renovations. So happy to be here and excited about working with the city and everyone else.
You want to call on the next person?
Oh yeah, sorry. Let's go with who else is here? Ben.
Ben may be tied up. He said he was going to be mainly listening, and I think that leaves Roseanne.
Roseanne. Yep.
Good afternoon, everyone. Roseanne Johnson with the Home Builders Association of Metropolitan Portland. Our members build all types of housing, including some with a capital A, affordable. So mixed use, single family, attached and detached, ADUs, remodels, and we are pleased to be part of this group. Thank you.
Thanks. So next on our agenda is just to quickly take a look at the minutes from last meeting and make sure those look accurate and adopt those. I'll put those up on the screen. Here we go. These were also included in your reminder email. Hopefully, maybe, possibly you had a chance to peek at those before this meeting. And so I'll just remain quiet, and if anyone wants to make a motion.
Mr. Economic Development, I move to approve these minutes.
Second.
Thank you. A motion from Ryan Carpenter and a second from, was that Mr. Stalkup?
Correct.
Okay. Any discussion on the matter? Okay, then I'll ask all those in favor of adopting the minutes as written.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? Okay. So I've tried to take what was discussed in last meeting and have that inform the discussion piece of today's meeting. But that will come in a moment. First, we will be privileged to hear from Sean Edging from DLCD. I'll let you introduce yourself and then just kind of jump into your presentation. But we've invited Sean. Roseanne made a good suggestion towards the end of last meeting, and that would be to have someone from DLCD come and talk with us a little bit about the different housing production strategies that they are recommending and seeing implemented effectively across the state. And so here he is in all his glory. We're excited to have him. And so do you feel like it's reasonable to fit what you have to say into about a half hour?
Yeah, and in fact, the presentation that I have is probably more than what I'll end up covering because, the housing production strategy is just one piece of that. So I'll spend just a lot of time focusing on that.
Okay, sounds good. And then we'll pepper him with any questions, and then we'll spin into our discussion portion of the meeting, which I anticipate will be about another 30 minutes or so. I don't want to gobble up everyone's entire afternoon because I do anticipate that we'll come back together probably at least once, maybe twice more before we wrap up our recommendations and present those to the city council. I anticipate, and I guess we'll get into this a little bit in later on in the meeting, but while we will present to city council, I think that the recommendations that come from this group will hopefully also inform the work that our consultant will do as part of the housing strategies that are incorporated into our housing needs analysis. Does that seem reasonable, Taylor?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay. So, I had a brief conversation with Ben Wheeler before jumping on this meeting, and he just wanted to ensure, and I do as well, that we're not meeting for the sake of meeting. We're meeting to make recommendations to council that will hopefully inform a legitimate housing production strategy across types of housing and different affordability levels. So our work here is meaningful. These aren't just meetings for the sake of meetings, and I want to just make that commitment to you. So without anything further from me, Sean, take it away. And let's see, I need to give you screen sharing privileges, don't I?
I believe so. But anyways, hey, I'll just introduce myself in the meantime. Hi, everybody. My name is Sean Edging. I'm a housing policy analyst here at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about both House Bills 2001 and 2003, but I'm going to be covering it in more of a, like, what are the concepts behind these and how can you utilize those concepts to encourage affordable housing inside your communities, as being a relatively smaller town, that isn't necessarily required to meet all of these like specific requirements of the state, but you have a lot of options and clearly a lot of political will to work towards that, So hopefully that will be useful to you guys. And I believe I have screen sharing now, so let me do this. So as we've already kind of talked about, just kind of at the beginning of this meeting, what we're, again, so we're talking about these bills, House Bill 2001 and 2003. And as we've kind of mentioned, Estacada being a city that is kind of below a lot of these population thresholds that are specified in statute, does not actually have any requirements under House Bills 2001 and 2003 that they really need to meet really at all. And of course, kind of mentioning this early, it did ruin my joke a little bit because I was going to pretend that that was the end of my presentation. But instead, I'm going to bring it around to just kind of talk about just the longer kind of implications of how you can use these concepts to increase housing affordability in your city. So I'll start with House Bill 2001, and I'll recognize that we don't really have that much time to dive into detail in House Bill 2001. So I'll try to compress this and really just give a gloss over of like what's the big idea behind middle housing. And the first thing to understand about middle housing is defining it and understanding what it is and how it relates to existing types of housing. Because I think this is something that a lot of people, struggle to think about, right? And I think the first thing to understand about middle housing is that in the US, specifically the US housing market, we have a very bifurcated housing market. We generally have two major types of housing that can be built in any US community, and that is the single family detached home and multifamily apartment complexes. And this is important because a lot of people tend to think of housing in this way. They think it's either a single family home, and if it's not a single family home, it's an apartment, right? But the reality is that housing is incredibly diverse. There's all of these different types of housing that exist, not just, from single family homes to mid-rise apartments to even high-rise apartments, but there's a bunch of housing types that exist in between the kind of extremes of multifamily apartments and detached single family homes. And that's kind of where middle housing lies. The main concept or key provision of middle housing that makes it work is trying to provide more smaller dwelling units at the scale of a house. So you'd have something roughly about the size of a house, or at least neighborhood scale, and it has more units in it. So each of those units is smaller. And this is something that was actually made illegal in most US cities sometime around the mid 20th century. Now, fast forwarding to now, in the kind of statewide picture, why are we starting to consider middle housing in greater detail? The first reason is that we're kind of in the midst of a full-blown housing crisis, and this also informs housing production strategies too. So I think this context is important. So I have all these numbers here, which aren't very useful for thinking about the housing crisis. This is actually a study done this last year that estimates housing all around the state. And I understand that these numbers don't mean a whole lot in isolation. Like, what does it mean to have 583,000 units that we need to build over the next 20 years? But to put it in perspective, the way I like to say is, based on our current rates of production today, if we wanted to meet this number over the next 20 years, we would actually need to double our production of housing. And more importantly, if we wanted to meet specifically these affordability categories right down here, people who are earning less money than the median income, we would need to triple our production of affordable housing. So these are very big numbers, and we need to be doing a lot just, at state and local levels to be encouraging the development of housing that we need to live in, right? And of course, this housing crisis doesn't necessarily, it affects all corners of the state. I think I haven't been to a community where folks don't have a housing issue, it's just different in each community. But one thing I think is important to note about this housing crisis is it doesn't affect everybody equally. Specifically, as we kind of look more into who is particularly burdened by the housing crisis, we find that people who don't earn a lot of money, low income households, renter households, households of color, people with disabilities, people as they age, all of these different categories of folks kind of disproportionately have these rates of cost burdening and are disproportionately affected by this housing crisis, right? So we have kind of this additional consideration if we're really trying to advance equitable outcomes to kind of address this housing crisis across the state. So why would we consider middle housing specifically in the single family detached zone? This gets at one of the kind of biggest constraints that we have in terms of our land supply, and that is in most cities throughout the US, the vast majority of cities throughout the US, on the vast majority of residential lands in the US, you are only generally allowed to build one housing type on a lot or parcel, and that is the single family detached home. All other types of housing are generally just illegal or very difficult to build if you're even allowed to do it, right? In the US, that's about 75% of all residential land is only allowed to build this one housing type. In Estacada, you see this kind of zone in the light yellow. This is your kind of low density residential zone, which allows single family detached dwellings. And as Matt pointed out, it also allows accessory dwelling units. And that's kind of the result of a previous state policy in 2017, which required cities above a certain size to allow ADUs in conjunction with a single family home. So we're already starting to work on kind of addressing that issue of most of our lands being kind of locked up. And I want to talk a little bit about an effect of that. Actually, I'm gonna pass this one thing that is kind of related to the single family exclusionary zone is the fact that a lot of the kind of earliest documents that have implemented single family zones have kind of had an underlying kind of exclusionary intent. There were a lot of policies that happened kind of in the early 20th century that sought to kind of disinvest in certain neighborhoods and reinforce separation of people on kind of racial and economic bounds. There's a lot of really good books that talk about the history of this. One of my favorites is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, but I won't dive into the details here. But I do want to talk a little bit about how this affects housing affordability, how this kind of landlocking of all of these lands affect housing. One kind of trend we've seen over the past several decades is, in spite of the fact that our households, the average American household, has been decreasing for the past, several decades and will continue to decrease in the future, our average square footage of households, the amount of house that we are building on a particular lot is increasing. It keeps increasing in spite of the fact that our households are getting smaller. And that's also in part why these houses are becoming so significantly expensive. One of the reasons for this is related to what we call the building envelope. And I try to make this diagram to illustrate this concept. If you were to have a lot or a parcel, there's on any one of these lots or parcels in your zoning code, you have regulations that specify where you can build a building and how big it can be. And so in any parcel, you can draw this kind of invisible imaginary box called a building envelope. That's kind of the accumulation of any zoning code's regulations that specify how big your building can be. It's like height restrictions, setbacks, things like that. And one kind of effect of having this single family zone that only allows one unit on a lot or parcel is it creates a very specific incentive for somebody who's building a house. And that is make the smallest lot or parcel that you're allowed to do, and then put the largest building that you can possibly put on that lot or parcel. And so the incentives are stacked towards, if you're only allowed to build one unit on this lot, you better make it as big as possible because that is how you're going to maximize your return on investment, right? And if you look, even in Estacada, I just kind of did a quick survey of some of the houses around Estacada. You can see examples of this where you see these really large single family homes that are built on these lots that kind of maximize building envelope. And that's kind of a rational response to zoning codes that developers are incentivized to do. Now,
That's
where
my
middle
house, Sean. That's my house.
is that your house?
No, I'm just joking.
I would feel really bad. I try to avoid addresses here. But what middle housing does is it kind of changes or tilts the incentives a little bit. What it does is it, provides the same house scale. So you get a similar or the same building envelope that you would get for a single family detached home. But internally, you're allowed to divide it into more configurations. So it can be 1, 2, 3, or 4 units. And a consequence of that is because you have the same building envelope, but you can provide more units, hypothetically, a developer can make significantly more money because they're selling more units, but each one of the units has to be smaller because it's limited to the scale of the house. And as a result of that, it's generally a little bit more affordable than it would otherwise be as a large single family detached home, right? And this is kind of another example. I actually had a hard time finding examples of middle housing in Estacada. They're kind of historic type homes. So this one's kind of older. So anyways, this kind of has implications for us as, as we design zoning codes to allow housing in our communities. With middle housing, the whole point of this is to provide that building envelope, that same building envelope of a house and that scale of a house, but to incentivize the development of smaller and hopefully more affordable housing units. Of course, it also has implications too. The more land that we require for our housing through things like minimum lot sizes, parking regulations, open space requirements, things like that, generally means that you need to provide more land for each individual unit. And that means the incentives tilt towards, if that unit's buildable at all, making it as big as you can. And additionally, if you design it and regulate it more like an apartment complex than like a house, it's going to look more like an apartment complex and function more like an apartment complex than a house. And then finally, whenever you're doing zoning codes, you always want to structure your incentives to encourage smaller, greater diversity of units, as well as the retention and conversion of existing homes rather than demolition and replacement of homes. So all of these factors are kind of important, and I think they're very useful for cities in thinking through these zoning code provisions. So I just wanted to share that. Hopefully that wasn't too, I don't know, too much, too little. In terms of House Bill 2001, we've kind of prepared this graphic that shows kind of what the bills does. It legalizes these different housing types in different sizes cities. It doesn't really impact Estacada in any way because you guys don't meet the population thresholds, but I do think that these concepts are useful, right? And if your goal is to kind of incentivize more affordable housing types. Now, let's move on to House Bill 2003, and this is where we're going to start getting into the housing production strategy more. House Bill 2003 is kind of the less popular younger brother of House Bill 2001 in that it didn't really receive much media coverage. But what's interesting about House Bill 2003 is it's probably going to have a much longer lasting impact than House Bill 2001. And there's 3 major components of it. I'm only really going to talk about 2 of them here today. The first component is a regional housing needs analysis. This is kind of a pilot or prototype methodology that the legislature asked a few state agencies to prototype or pilot for the sake of, just kind of having a test run and seeing how something like this could maybe be incorporated in the future, maybe. But again, that's all theoretical at this point. So I'm going to be focusing instead on the housing needs analysis schedule, as well as the housing production strategy, right? So let's start with the housing needs or capacity analysis. This is the process that you guys will be undergoing in the near future. House Bill 2003 kind of establishes a regular schedule. This doesn't apply to Estacada because you guys are a smaller city, but the process, as I kind of like to share with folks who might not be familiar with it, is a question about land capacity and availability. The question you guys are going to be really grappling with over the next few months is, hey, we have this urban growth boundary. Do we have enough land inside that boundary zoned to the appropriate densities that would allow us to accommodate the housing units that we would expect over the next 20 years, right? So this process generally starts with a population forecast. This is provided by the state. It's done at Portland State University. That then goes to the local level where cities then take that number and based on kind of the existing characteristics of folks in their UGB, they determine how many households they would expect to see over the next 20 years. That's called a housing needs projection. From there, they do an inventory of all the lands that exist inside their urban growth boundary and estimate how much housing they think that they would expect to see based on, the zoning, based on which lots are vacant, which lots aren't vacant or partially vacant, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, if they find that they don't have enough land inside their urban growth boundary, they are required by law to do something about it to accommodate needed housing. And generally that includes one of two things. It includes either increasing density of lands inside the urban growth boundary or it includes expanding the urban growth boundary to include more lands inside that urban growth boundary. Both of which have kind of their nuances to them. There's kind of requirements on both ends. It gets really complicated, so I'll kind of gloss over that here. But instead, I'll kind of move into talking a little bit about this new requirement, the housing production strategy, right? If the H&A is a process that's all thinking about land, right? As I'm sure, a lot of you folks have housing development experience in this room, land is only one part of the equation. It's a very important part of the equation, but I think, most of you know that even if you have land that's available hypothetically for development, that doesn't mean a house will actually be built there, right? There might not be infrastructure to support it. There might not be the right financial circumstances to support it. There might not be the market for it, et cetera, et cetera. And to kind of get at that piece, we have this housing production strategy, which asks a city a different question. It specifically asks them, what is your city doing? What strategies is your city implementing over the next 6 or 8 years to actually promote the development of housing, that you would expect to see as part of your H&A. So this goes beyond just saying, do we have enough land? And it's asking, well, what are we doing to actually make housing development more likely, right? And so that consists of kind of a few different components of it. The first piece is an H&A, or a housing needs analysis. Is a pretty old type of document. It's something that's been around since like the 70s, or at least the rules for it have been. And the first piece about that is we are aware today that there's a lot more factors around housing and housing need that aren't really addressed in an H&A. I think a great example of this is people who experience a disability. We know that a lot of people who live with disabilities have particularly specific housing needs, not just in terms of accessibility, but also in terms of like affordability and their ability to like stay in a home, right? And that's not something we really consider as part of an H&A. And so the first part of a housing production strategy is taking that need in your H&A and contextualizing it, asking all these different questions like, hey, what is housing like for these different state and federal protected classes? What is it like for people as they age? What are all these different factors that can help us get a better picture of the housing need in our city? There's an engagement component as well, where you reach out to the people who consume and produce housing and ask them, what types of strategies do you guys think we need, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, there's this kind of strategies portion where you actually think about the types of actions that you do. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's also an achieving fair and equitable housing outcomes section, which I'll also talk about in a minute. There are reporting requirements. These wouldn't really apply to you folks in Estacada. But I guess I won't really talk about them much here, as well as kind of enforcement and compliance measures. But again, neither of these are really pertinent to Estacada. So to talk about the strategies, right? When we think about an H&A, right, it's all about land capacity. But as we've kind of talked about, there's a lot of things that affect whether housing will actually be developed or not. And one of the kind of things that we tried to do as much as we could during administrative rulemaking was we had access to all of these people throughout the states who were, you know, housing experts and had a lot of experience in housing development, things like that. And we kind of crowdsourced all of these different strategies that a city could consider as part of a housing production strategy. And so, you know, we've kind of tried to compile it into this very large, but definitely not comprehensive list that cities can, you know, look at and they can kind of choose from. They can, you know, see what strategies might fit their city well and then adapt it for use in their city. And you'll notice if you read these kind of categories, these extend very far beyond just land use. They extend into things like financial incentives, into tax abatements and tax resources, how we go about acquiring and leveraging land for you know, the development of housing, especially affordable housing. And, you know, in each one of these categories, there's a series of different strategies that are kind of specific actions that you could actually implement over time. And of course, we also have kind of a catch-all category that enables cities to, if they have different ideas than what's provided in this list, be able to implement it and, you know, potentially build this list in the future, right? And actually, really, that's about it. There's a piece on the regional housing needs analysis that is kind of the rest of these slides, but I'm actually not going to talk about that again, because I think what the point of this conversation is supposed to be the housing production strategy specifically. So I'm going to pause there.
So pause or wrap up.
I think wrap up. I guess what I'll move into now is just kind of asking you guys that obviously that's a very high level overview of what a housing production strategy is. It's a document that's just intended to build on the H&A and recognize that an H&A is about land availability, but an HPS is about what a city is doing to encourage the development of housing. And yeah, I guess, you know, really the rest of the presentation is just about the RHNA, which is not really the focus of today's conversation.
Okay. Well, I'm going to restrain myself for a moment and just kind of open up the floor to questions, reflections, just anything that really stood out to folks that they kind of want to emphasize here. Specifically questions that you might have for Sean as well before he leaves us.
I see 2 hands raised.
Oh, yep. Let's see here. Katie, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I'm super interested in the middle housing piece for a lot of different reasons, but I guess I would really, really like to know the difference between creating an opportunity and encouraging or incentivizing that type of development. Because when we open the opportunity up to someone to build any type of middle housing, as you said, how do we tip that scale? What do you find is like the most, I would say, most incentivizing incentive? Sorry, I was up until like 11 o'clock last night in city council, so I'm a little tired.
Totally understand, yeah.
But you know, with the middle housing, when we offer the opportunity for this is housing or this is land that we would like to see this type of housing, this is what we'd like to encourage. How do you actually go about encouraging it? I'm really curious about it.
Yeah. The biggest thing that affects whether middle housing is developed and whether it's developed, you know, in that kind of smaller scale is all about land. So one of the biggest things that kind of cities do when they start thinking about housing is they'll think like, oh, this is increased density. They think this is more housing number or housing units per dwelling or dwelling units per acre. Apologies. And in response to that, a generally kind of rational response is, well, we should require these units to have more land per dwelling unit. So we're going to require these duplexes to have, you know, more land than what we would require for a single family detached home. So it's going to have a bigger minimum lot size. It's going to provide a lot more parking. It's going to provide this open space. It's going to provide, you know, more driveway space and access, et cetera, et cetera. And a consequence of that is that means, you know, in order to actually build a duplex, a developer needs to find more land, which is very expensive. And not only is it very expensive, but because those dwelling units are going to be on such a big lot, right? And that building envelope is very big, it makes very rational sense for them to build those things as big as they can possibly make it, right? And so what ends up happening is, yeah, sure, you allow duplexes, but one, it might not really be all that possible because it's, you know, the land is too expensive to acquire and build that duplex. But secondly, if one is built, it's going to be huge and it's probably not going to be that affordable, right? So that's kind of the big trade-off. You have to think like, you know, if you want this, you have to think very critically about the trade-offs you're willing to make in terms of space, because that's the biggest limiting factor. There are a lot of other nuanced things like how we approach infrastructure finance, how we approach lot divisions, because being able to sell individual units is a big incentive for developers, things like that. But I'd really say the biggest one, and the one that we focused on the most during rulemaking, is how much land are we asking to build these middle housing types to ensure that it, you know, kind of matches the scale of the house and makes units smaller.
Deborah had something. Are you there, Deborah?
I am here. Sean answered it in his answer to Katie, so I'm good.
Okay.
Awesome.
Heath.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention, or just sort of ask, I've been in Estacada my whole life, and we've actually sort of went away from what he's talking about, because we started out when I was developing properties 28 years ago in Estacada, the standard lot size was 100 by 50. And then they moved the standard lot size to 75 by 100. And down in, what do you call that? Down by the river.
Lakeshore?
Lakeshore area, there's actually lots, tax lots that are like 15 by 100 or 75 or 20 by, but you can't build on them. So you have to buy multiple lots to be able to build on them. And so at one time, it was designed years ago to be a cabin type community. And the best way to deal with that, in my opinion, is it's not about the size of the lot. It's about how much square footage of the lot can have a building on it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a 2,500 square foot lot and you're only allowed to cover 50% of that with a structure, then the developer has to build a structure that'll fit on the land appropriately sized. And you're going to find people, especially in this new, the new market of tiny homes and that type of thing, you will find people that will want to buy that. And the developer can keep the cost down by doing that. But I agree 100% with what Sean's saying, because being a developer, we run into that all the time where it's like, oh man, we have a lot and a half here. And we've had several properties like that in Estacada where we bought them. It's like, there's a lot and a half here, but we still can only do a single house. So let's add on to this single house so we can get more money out of this single house rather than go to the city to try to divide this in half and just build a smaller structure that we could sell separately. The reverse side of that is, if I was the guy next door that had a beautiful house and all of a sudden they changed the zoning to where now they can put 4 little cabins right next to me, I might not be happy. So that is the balance of the city council and things they have to look at. But anyway, I just wanted to share that. And the way I understand it, Sean, that's sort of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, it's about those kind of trade-offs, right? The more square footage that, say, a developer can build, you know, on any given lot, increases its feasibility or ability to actually, you know, pencil out and be sold and, you know, be developed, right? And one of the biggest incentives you can provide middle housing is giving them that square footage. So, you know, I hate to bring City of Portland into this, right? They're the worst. But one thing they do to try to incentivize that more is, you know, for single family homes, they've actually really downsized what you can build for a single family home, right? It used to be these large 3-story single family homes that you could build, and they've scaled that down through some fancy math that they do. But what they try to do to incentivize middle housing is they've given them slightly bigger boxes that they can build in, right? So if you're going to build a duplex or a triplex even, your boxes or your allowable building envelope is just going to be larger. And that gives more square footage and makes it more likely that those middle housing types will actually pencil or be feasible.
Yeah, basically they pared down the base zone significantly, like the floor area ratio for any given residential base zone. But then if you add more units, you get a bonus. So then you can add more units and get a little bit more square footage to be able to put those units in. But it does affect the land values. We think probably over time it's going to cause the land values are going to have to adjust downward if that's going to work out, if the homes will actually be built.
Yeah, and I think you're right that it's complicated and kind of imperfect, right? You have to balance a lot of things that get into what people want to live, like what they want their communities to look like.
Ben, I saw you
I got a-
unmuted. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I got a question. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
This doesn't pertain to the city of Estacada, but it pertains to the state as a whole. Why do we put such a focus on cramming more square footage or housing units on 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 square foot lots, 3,000 square foot lots, pick your number, when we have an overabundance of 1 to 80 acre lots, particularly in the Willamette Valley, that you could very easily add a dwelling unit to and create this secondary market
Yes.
and not create a burden to neighbors. You know, most neighbors wouldn't notice if you put an ADU unit on a 5 acre lot.
Great point, Ben.
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of reasons for that, and I think I can't really cover like the history of the statewide land use planning program, as well as, you know, kind of the conservation of farmland in this state. That's like a huge history to dive into. That's very politically messy. But kind of one thing I think it's worth pointing out that in terms of trade-offs is when you start building out, the consequence of that is in order to build out, you need to also build transportation networks that accommodate that. And people also, in order to reach, say, their jobs or, you know, reach grocery stores or reach the places they're trying to go, have to drive farther than they otherwise would if they were living close in together. So there's this kind of trade-off that happens in communities where, you know, the more you grow out, the higher your transportation costs come, but then maybe the lower your housing costs become. And the closer in you build, or the more densely and high up you build, the more your housing costs, you know, kind of increase, but then the less your transportation costs. So that's kind of one piece that plays into it. So like in places like Texas, where they kind of allow that, you know, very large expansion outwards, you know, they have, you know, kind of somewhat lower single family home costs in those regions, but the trade-off is you have to drive very far, like hours, and there's significant congestion, and all of that road infrastructure is subsidized through tax money, right? So you have increased taxes to actually pay for that infrastructure to serve all of those single family detached dwellings that are spread out. So infrastructure costs are also significantly higher. So that's part of the trade-off. The other piece that I think is also kind of important to keep in mind is by having that same system where we're still going to be building out, but not actually addressing the size of housing units, isn't actually going to do a whole lot for affordability, right? So let's say you opened up all these lands, but you still only allow them to build these large single family homes on big lots, right? One of the consequences of that is those houses are still, you saw that graph earlier where the housing size was increasing year after year after year, even though household size was decreasing. That trend's going to continue, and housing is still going to get much more expensive. A great example of this, if you would like to see a state that has tried that, is the state of California, actually, right? If you drive between cities, you'll notice that there is farmland, but between those cities, there's also a lot of very sprawling subdivisions because they don't have that same system of controlling their urban growth out from a particular city, or at least they implemented it way later and not as effectively. And, you know, California is not exactly the model for housing affordability that we would want to follow, right? It didn't really do much to address affordability. One of the biggest problems that California has is that they are not willing to densify in existing neighborhoods, and they are really restricting their supply of housing lands because they both can't build out because the infrastructure and transportation networks don't support it, and they can't build up because neighbors don't want to see it. So they're, you know, you end up in a similar bind, but the chains are different, if that makes sense.
I think you kind of missed or maybe I didn't phrase it correctly. You could do it similar to where the city of Estacada did with ADUs. We limit square footage size on an ADU unit. And so you say you have a 1929 farmhouse on 60 acres and it's zoned for an 80 acre zoning minimum.
Mm-hmm.
What the benefit of that is that that homeowner likely owns that land and house outright. they can put that on there to supplement their quote unquote farm and keep that in farm ground versus selling out to a sprawling subdivision on the edge of town. Because it's not a gradual phase out. It's a 7,000 square foot lot, and now we're in 80 acre zoning surrounding the city of Estacada.
Yeah. Well, I mean, 80 acres is a lot of land, right? Right. And adding one housing unit to that is going to be kind of a, adding a pebble to a pond, right?
But if you do that, if you allow that statewide, it's a huge pebble and in a big puddle. A lot of pebbles in a puddle.
I would
I know what you're
add,
saying.
and I would just add to that, this is Deborah, I would add to that it reflects the reality of what is actually happening already. People are building those illegal, perhaps, dwellings on their large farmland, in our area anyway, and families are living together and figuring out ways to make that work. So I think, but it's illegal, and they are at risk of both unstable and vulnerable housing and county code enforcement, and at risk for their neighbor's complaint. So how can we, I think there's a continuum here, and what Ben's bringing up needs to be part of the continuum. I realize that's probably outside the limits of the city of Estacada, but it does affect affordable housing in our region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say it kind of gets into the significant statewide controversy that deals with kind of land use, especially on rural lands. One thing we know about middle housing is, in spite of the fact of it being more or less illegal everywhere, prior to House Bill 2001, we also know that people are willing to do illegal setups to have more housing options available to them. And that's not just on farmlands, that's also within cities too. So there's a lot of, single family homes that functionally are 2 dwelling units. They just don't appear that way in a city because it's technically illegal, right? So I think that works in a lot of different scenarios, or that dynamic happens in a lot of scenarios.
So I'd just like to keep us focused and maybe recognize that I think there's valid arguments to be made here, but we're largely talking about unincorporated areas right now. And the focus of this meeting is incorporated Estacada because that's where our jurisdiction lies. So let's try and, I guess, just stay focused there. Looks like Roseanne and I think Katie had something to contribute, but let's go to Roseanne first.
Yeah, I agree with that. I know this housing work group that we have established is obviously within the city limits, but at the same time, RRFF, rural residential farm forest zoned areas in unincorporated county has a role and an impact. And so Ben, I can talk to you offline about a bill that HVA has in the state legislature right now that would allow for counties to authorize rural ADUs. So ADUs on any, RRFF zoned property within the county, up to 900 square feet. So that would be awesome. But, at the same time, this group is talking about inside city limits. So I want to just emphasize Sean's point that land, no matter any way you slice it, land is the biggest line item in any developer's budget, whether you be building multifamily, you be building 2 units like a duplex or 2 attached homes, or you be building a cottage cluster on a parcel. Land is going to be your number one, your highest cost line item. Lumber and materials are kind of edging their way up there, but still land is the biggest cost in Oregon and in Estacada too. And it's a kind of a symbiotic network. The Portland metro area has had huge growth. We have a deficit of 70,000 units in the Portland metro region alone. And that has an impact on Estacada, which is outside the metro area, but is feeling that pressure, that upward price pressure, because there's been this historic underproduction and deficit that Sean had his slide on. And because people still want to live in, the beautiful state of Oregon and all of its surrounding metro areas. So when we talk about how we can increase the supply side as one solution to housing affordability, We really need to look at what can be done with the land. And so to Sean's point, how many units you can build on a piece on the same square footage of a parcel is key. And that's the main message behind House Bill 2001 is how many additional dwelling units can you get? And those dwelling units are going to de facto be relatively more affordable. Relatively, okay? Not like it's going to all of a sudden become capital A affordable to 80 or 60% MFI. That would be great if it does, and probably maybe the more units we create, maybe we can achieve that, but they will become relatively more affordable than a single dwelling detached home on that same square footage area of a parcel. So thank you.
Katie.
Yes, I just really wanted to touch base really quickly while we've got you, Sean. Category C that you had in the housing production strategies was financial incentives. In the 3 years that I've been on city council, we have only actually approved one multifamily community. Heath Stallcup is here, and he knows that in the entire time I've been on council, the almost 3 years, we've only had one apartment building come through. And we were so excited about it that we were able to offer them a $250,000 grant through our urban renewal agency to help that project pencil out. That being said, in the future, should we want to provide that same level of incentive, we're going to be unable to do that through our urban renewal agency as we've exhausted that source. So that being said, I wanted to talk to you about what you see in the state of Oregon as being some of the more successful financial incentives, whether that be anecdotal from other cities, or if you could just at least speak on what you would see as being more of, you know, a financial incentive that we as a city could be looking at, especially based on our size.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, this is touching on a big theme that was kind of part of rulemaking, and that I think, you know, I actually didn't say this during the presentation, but I think should be clear. The point of a housing production strategy isn't to say that like cities need to, you know, pony up all of this additional funding to build housing, right? That's just not realistic, you know, because you guys have limited budgets, you guys have limited ability for your staff to actually direct that budget and get these projects to pencil. And I think one of the important things that I've kind of learned in going through this process is that financial incentives are kind of twofold. There are public financial incentives like what you described with that kind of urban renewal area type of things. But you know, most development, especially market rate development, right, is something that occurs through private financial markets, right? They receive their financing mechanisms through private means. And there are levers that exist at the local level that can affect somebody's ability, a developer's ability to acquire financing and make that financing cheaper for them, which tilts the favor of developing that housing towards being able to pencil. A few good examples of that include, well, one of the biggest actually is probably system development charges. So obviously in any city, funding infrastructure is important, right? And the federal government over time, over the last 50 or 60 years, has really kind of disinvested in investing in infrastructure. And as a result, most cities have kind of had to pick up that slack. And the way they do that is by saying to developers, you're going to pay these SDC costs. It's going to cost X amount of money per home. And it's based on kind of these different schedules that they develop, right? One of the important things behind that SDC is it has a tendency to pull incentives a certain way. So like, let's say somebody builds a single family home, right? If a SDC assumes that that single family home has an equivalent water impact to say one apartment unit, that really incentivizes the single family home and really disincentivizes the apartment, because to build say 20 apartments, you have to pay 20 times the amount for water infrastructure for one building, right? And so one thing that cities can consider is, how do you actually charge for infrastructure development? And how can you incentivize that to get more housing types that we would, you know, say be smaller and more affordable and potentially have less impact on the infrastructure system overall? There's also, for SDCs, when you collect those fees, right? So most communities, when they charge SDCs, once they give you the approval thing, they say, you know, in order to get a building permit, you have to submit your SDCs at X time. Where a lot of developers will tell you, hey, those have very significant holding costs because we actually can't sell these units until the building is actually built, right? And so what a lot of cities have started doing is saying, all right, well, we'll defer this until you want your certificate of occupancy, right? And that reduces their holding costs and actually makes them much more able to build those units and be able to pay the SDCs later before they actually start leasing the units, right? So that's just kind of a small example of the kind of levers that exist at the city level that aren't directly them, changing the amount of money that they're providing particular developers or changing the amount of money that they have in their budgets to provide services for residents. But it does change the math in terms of how developers consider, like, is this actually going to work? Is this project going to work in this community? And I think there's a lot of small examples like that that can really be touched on that can, tilt those levers a little bit.
So Sean, I'm going to pat our committee on the back and say 2 of the recommendations we currently have on our list are SDC deferrals, which you just mentioned,
Yeah.
and restructuring our SDC schedule to better reflect the burden, for example, like you said, between a single family home versus an apartment, making sure that those fees reflect reality. So appreciate the
The affirmation.
the affirmation there. The one thing that I kind of wanted to chime in and say, the math on restructuring SDCs is going to have to be done by someone a lot smarter than me. Well, that's number one, because I'm not that smart, but number 2, also, the thing that I can't quite figure out here, and that this smart person's going to have to figure out, is how do you add, so you're saying increased density, which, I tend to be, for the most part, in favor of within an urbanized area. It makes all sorts of sense for all sorts of reasons. But that means more rooftops, which means more people, which means theoretically more burden on public services, the very public services and infrastructure that are funded by SDCs. And so you get this, it's a real conundrum. We're saying reduce the fees and incentivize the density, but then by adding the density, you add the burden to the city's services and infrastructure without a way to pay for it, or at least that's the way it appears to me. And that's, how do you solve that?
Yeah, so a good thing to keep in mind is when you're thinking of, let's say, about a quadplex, right? That's 4 units in this, size of a house approximately, right? If you were to compare a quadplex to one single family home, generally the quadplex is going to have a somewhat higher infrastructure impact, right? It's generally going to use a little bit more water. It's going to have greater sewer impacts. It might even require separate connections, things like that. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is you can't compare a quadplex to a single family home. You have to compare it to 4 single family homes, right? So for each, household that you have that needs a house, they're going to need a housing unit, right? And they're going to be here unless it gets so unaffordable that they can't actually live here. And one of the things to keep in mind is for each kind of low density, right, housing unit that we build, we have to extend roads to them. We have to maintain those roads. We have to build sidewalks. Those are really expensive improvements. Plus, we also have to maintain longer water pipes. We have to maintain longer sewer pipes. We have to have pumping stations. We have to provide all of these things. So yes, density is more expensive for a particular lot or a particular area. But when you think about it in aggregate, what is really expensive actually is providing infrastructure services to low density residential buildings. So that's kind of the main thing behind SDCs, is reflecting the fact that when you have these kind of higher density units, yes, an apartment complex uses more, has greater infrastructure demands than one single family home, but you have to compare it more, well, if we didn't build this 20 unit apartment complex, instead we're going to have a lot more single family homes that all have this kind of infrastructure, collective infrastructure impact, right? And if we're incentivizing that.
I agree 100%. I guess it's just, that's where the smart person has to come in to figure out how you don't undercharge and don't overcharge in your fees.
I agree. And I think that's somebody smarter than me too. But, I have faith. I believe you are Mr. Estacada man, so.
Oh gosh, yeah, all right. My name precedes.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
Matt.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So to give you some numbers with that, just because I've tracked it considerably, when I had our 16-plex apartment, the average water bill / sewage bill per unit was basically not quite, it was about 40% of one of our single family residential units where we played the water and sewer on. So per unit on the apartment complex, it's less than 50% usage than a regular 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in the city of Estacada. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Almost a third.
yeah,
So almost 3 2-bedroom apartments are using almost the same water. And that's for a lot of reasons too, because if you're an apartment, you're not necessarily out watering your grass and watering your garden and watering your plants and doing things like that.
right. Yeah. No, it makes sense. Again, I guess I wasn't trying to defy Sean as much as just say that figuring out what that correct fee schedule is that's a
It's
tall
hard.
order.
Yeah.
Roseanne, and then I think we probably need to jump into the next phase of our meeting. Thank you, Sean, for your time, but let's get to Roseanne and see what she has.
Yeah, so I think I was just going to add on to what Sean had to say with what I call tiered SDCs. So restructuring, based on a combination of policy as well as, data. Jurisdictions have used like winter water use as a proxy for both like sewer and looking at sewer and water infrastructure rates and tiering them appropriately. But I think what I was going to say is that like his example of a quadplex versus a single family home, you have to compare each of the quadplex units to a single family home. Well, it's not that the quadplex is going to be, 1/4 of the single family home. It's probably going to be slightly more, right? Because you can actually fit a whole, some kind of household into that smaller unit. And each household, as we know, has to have a kitchen of some sort, right? So you are going to be cooking in there and using the restrooms and, using some sort of transportation, whether it be public or private, from that dwelling unit. So it's not like a 1-to-4 ratio to like single dwelling to quadplex, 1 unit of a quadplex, but it's probably something, on the order of like 0.3 or 0.4 or 0.5, something like that, right? So that's the idea behind a tiered infrastructure SDC system, is that, they wouldn't be paying just 1/4 of the amount, but they'd be paying a little bit more because obviously a full household is going to be in there, but just not having as much impact as a single dwelling unit. So just wanted to clarify that a bit.
Yeah, pretty much. We know it's not 1-to-4 and we know it's not 1-to-1.
Mm-hmm.
We know it's somewhere in between those two extremes.
Sean, thank you for your time and your presentation. I really, I like this slide. I guess it's 27 of 32 here, the one I just had up on the screen with the strategies in categories. I think that's helpful and helps guide our conversation. And I've got a stump grinder right outside my window right now, so sorry about that.
No worries. I'll also send you the full document so you have it. Don't read it. It's too long to read in one sitting, but so that way you guys have, that comprehensive, or not comprehensive, but longer list of strategies you can consider.
Okay. If you want to hang around, you're welcome to, Sean, but if not, I guess we'll let you go.
Honestly, I love kind of seeing what's going on at the local level, so I'd be happy to hang out.
Okay, that sounds good. Let me get our agenda back up here.
While he's doing that, can I just say one thing, going back to Sean's presentation on House Bill 2001, the medium-sized cities, which, eventually Estacada will probably be a medium-sized city that's outside the Portland Metro UGB. So you could start thinking, and, maybe not this group, but like Planning Commission and City Council could start thinking about, do we want to allow duplexes on every single, dwelling zoned lot, akin to what House Bill 2001 requires for medium cities? So medium cities only have to do duplexes on in areas that allow for single dwelling units. So that's just something to consider, because I know that some of the more rural areas like Newburgh, Sandy as a medium city, they're going gung-ho on it and trying to incentivize more middle housing, and even allowing like detached duplexes, which the state defines a duplex as attached or detached, and the city can decide if they want to have detached duplexes. So it's just amazing opportunities out there to incentivize additional for sale and or rental units that are relatively smaller, utilizing the best use of land for housing that would already have housing on it anyway. So something to think about for that medium city that Estacada will be one day.
Let's go Joe and then Katie.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Roseanne and I both sit on another committee with West Lynn, and they're going through some of the same things that we're talking about here, although they're kind of forced into it. And I think that's actually almost easier than what Estacada, because they have options, whereas West Lynn has to do this. They have to abide by HB 2003 and 2001. But there's some great stuff on their website. So if anybody wants to read the surveys that they've done, and they hired a consultant to work with them as well, there's some of the same information that they have, but I think it might be helpful for folks if they want to do some more reading to see what West Lynn is doing as well.
I just wanted to chime in and let both, I guess, everyone know, if you're not from the Estacada area, haven't been following what we've been doing in the city. Last year, when we redid our comprehensive zoning map, we did make sure that a lot of the residential areas that we established, especially the North City residential area, we did make sure that there were options to build a diversity of housing types and not just single family. I did want to share one quick anecdote with everybody that's on this screen right here. Last year, around February or March, it was right before COVID, we approved a subdivision application in the city council, and there's been some discussion happening amongst councilors. It's going to end up probably becoming a very, very public discussion that happens very soon. I'm going to speak on a personal level. These are statements that I'm making as a personal Katie Dunsmuir, and I could be Councilor Katie Dunsmuir, but I don't speak on behalf of the council when I say this. Anecdotally, last year when we approved the Faraday Hills subdivision, they asked for us to make a modification to the minimum lot size. They were doing so under the impression, or they were giving us the impression, that they were going to be building a diversity of housing types. So the smaller the lot size, the smaller the house, the more affordable it is. That is what we want to do. That is what we want you to approve. So we made an exception for their minimum lot size from 7,500 square feet minimum to 3,400 square foot. It was the exception that we made for them. And they have now started advertising those homes and those lots specifically. I have confirmed by comparing the subdivision application to the RMLS listing that they currently have up, that they are selling the 3,400 square foot lot sizes for a minimum of $400,000. And we are not going to have that level of diversity that the rest of the council, or that at least I was under the impression of and really hopeful for. I actually kind of started crying because as a recent divorcee, I got divorced within the last year, and I'm raising my 2 kids, and I was really hoping that someday there was going to be something affordable for me to buy in my city. And I was really thinking Faraday Hills was going to be it, because we made the exception for them to build smaller homes on smaller lot sizes, and that's not what's happening. They're capitalizing on exactly what Sean was speaking to earlier. You can fit the bigger house on the smaller lot size, and you can just pack them all in there. You can make a lot more money on your investments. And that's what's been happening. And that's what a lot of us are experiencing here in Estacada, is this disparity in affordability, and us thinking, well, gosh, if we could cut the land size in half, because as Roseanne was saying earlier, land size or land is the biggest price tag that you pay when you're purchasing a home. So if we could make the land smaller, we could make those homes a lot more affordable for different people to buy. And that's just hasn't been the case in our city. I wanted to share that anecdote with everybody, because it's been very, very disappointing to see that that's what happened. So I really appreciate Sean's input today regarding how actually putting bigger lot sizes is kind of how we might be able to achieve that middle housing there. So thank you for the 2 seconds on that one, you guys.
I just had a quick question, Katie. Was there a variety of lot sizes within Faraday Hills, or was it just the one lot size?
No, there's a variety. The largest one is 26,000, but there really are not very many of those lots.
26,000 square feet lot?
There was one or two of them.
Oh, wow. So what about the 7,500 square foot lot, 7,500 square foot lots that was like kind of the base zone? Did any of those get built?
So they haven't been built yet. They just started plotting or, platting them out, and they just started advertising them. And the ones that they're currently advertising are in phase 1, which are some of those smaller lots. And I was just pulling up, the lot sizes and comparing what was on the subdivision application. Lot 38 right now is being advertised on rmls.com, or I guess it's called HomeSnap now. But it's being advertised at 400,000. And when you pull up the subdivision application, its exact lot size is 3,400 square feet.
Yeah, I'll be curious to know. The reason I'm asking is I would just be curious to know what once the 7,500 square foot lot homes go on the market or start becoming advertised, how much their starting prices will be and ending prices will be.
I know that right now the range that I've seen is between 400 minimum and 563, I think is the most that I saw earlier today. But that's not on the largest lot size. I think that's actually on a 5,000 square foot lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just to give you a little bit of perspective, like that's pretty low considering the 6 counties that HBA covers. And I know that it's probably seems like so high compared to what you've seen being an Estacada City resident for a long time or for a while. But I think housing, if you look on RMLS, like the inventory is so low right now, and it's creating so much upward pressure.
Don't get me wrong. I understand that a lot of pricing is determined by the market. And I understand that right now the market's pricing is completely based on supply and demand. I'm an apartment manager. I know that better than anybody else. I know that for me here, if I have a studio go up for $1,200 on the market, it's going to rent very quickly because people are desperate and literally have nothing else to do. But when you're talking about affordability, for someone or for a household to afford a 400,000 square foot home, you're talking about a household that's bringing in $100,000 a year. And
what's the square footage of that house on that small lot?
I don't memorize everything.
I was just curious because I'm just wondering, are they building 3 stories high, or are they trying to maximize the square footage?
If you want to pull up the RMLS, they've started advertising a lot of different floor plans in Faraday Hills subdivision. I think that the smallest one was 1,600 and can go anywhere up to 25 or something around there.
Yeah, because see, I think that the way to, in the future for the city with this medium size housing is you have to, just so the builder knows what's going on too. I think it was totally okay to do a 3,500 square foot lot. But I think you guys should have put some strict regulations on, but you can't build more than an 1,100 square foot, 3-bedroom, 1-bath house on that land. The amount of square foot of land you have, the house can only cover so much of that land. And so that's the way you keep the cost down, because the builders are going to want to try to make as much money as possible. And if there's no regulations put on what they can build, then they're going to build that 1,600 square foot house and they're going to get 400,000. If they would have had to build a 900 square foot or 1,000 square foot house, then the price is going to be down a little bit lower, more like 350, because it wouldn't appraise for 400. Anyway.
Pretty much.
Yeah, I'll just, oh,
sorry. The point there, I think, is trust, don't incentivize, don't trust.
Exactly.
Sorry, Taylor.
yeah, no problem. I was just gonna add, so I have a mountain of building permits on my desk right now, and a lot of those are for the Faraday Hills subdivision. And so I just pulled one out, and I think a lot of them are going to look pretty similar to this one. The lot size is 3,800 square feet, and the building coverage area is 1,167 square feet. So the building coverage is just over 30% of the lot. Our code does does prescribe a maximum lot coverage. I feel like it's 55%. You can go up to 55%, which seems high. Of course, we also have like the setbacks that apply. So yeah, if that's, in case that's helpful for anyone thinking about what those numbers look like.
I think this conversation is relevant, obviously. I guess I'm just mindful of our agenda. We're at 80 minutes right now, and so I think what we're going to be forced to do is probably table most of what we have left on our agenda for our next meeting, and that's okay. But before we adjourn, I want to update the group on the vertical housing development zone that was approved last night. And so we did it through resolution rather than ordinance, and it becomes effective then immediately. What is not yet available is the actual application and all of that sort of administrative stuff, which we'll try and get in place as quickly as possible. But that vertical housing zone is in our downtown, in our D zone, and so will be available to those who want to take advantage of it.
Matt,
Taylor,
how many net buildable acres, or I guess how many acres does it cover? It's a pretty small area, right?
how many acres is our downtown zone?
Is your VHDZ application within the downtown zone?
It encompasses the entire downtown zone.
Okay, so and then how many acres is that?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Okay.
Maybe 30 or 40.
And do you know how many are like vacant and available for being able to be utilized in that capacity?
Well, there are more redevelopment opportunities than there are new development opportunities. You know, there are buildings in downtown Estacada that the city of Portland probably would have condemned decades ago. And I don't say that to be disparaging. I'm saying that as a matter of fact. You know, they're built out of clay tile construction, and they literally would not be allowed to stand because there's such a health and safety risk.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of the redevelopment opportunities. There are non-conforming single-family uses that still exist downtown that could be redeveloped. There are a few undeveloped lots that maybe had a structure on them ages ago that was demolished and has never been rebuilt. It runs the real gamut.
The reason I'm asking is just that, you know, have in addition to council passing the resolution, is there any kind of PR, public relations, or media campaign around it to get the word out that your city, you know, is open for business for a new, you know, for mixed use, which is what the VHDZ incentivizes, is mixed use. So I know you have a developer that was asking for it, and then our committee here recommended it as well. And then, you know, but then beyond that, is there like any kind of media campaign or public relations work that's going to be getting the broader message out to developers?
Yeah, we'd love to go that direction. It was approved, you know, like 12 hours ago.
Yeah,
so.
It's nascent.
So
well,
yeah.
Anyway, HBA is happy to, you know, outwardly communicate whatever press release you guys generate as well.
Thank you for that offer. Taylor, I think, already gave us an update on the HNA situation. We're about to finalize a contract with our consultant. Is that right, Taylor?
Yes, it has been signed.
Okay, excellent. So again, hopefully what the outcome of this committee's work will inform the strategy aspect of what will come out of that final HNA document. Let's see here. Joe or Jill, I hope one of you will be able to be at our next meeting, simply because I did want to have a conversation with this group about a potential partnership with the Housing Authority. We hosted a group of county commissioners a few weeks ago here to look at potential sites to develop some sort of either subsidized or public housing development here. But what's missing is, of course, what's always missing, and that is the money. And so the county, it sounds like may, and Joe, this is where I don't want to misspeak here, but what I heard Jill saying to your elected officials in that walk by that we did was there's a lot of single family public housing units that are going to have to be repositioned, liquidated in order to do some sort of new development project in Estacada or anywhere. Do I have that right?
Yep, you sure do. Yeah, we've got about 150 or so single family homes and duplexes that we're going to be repositioning, probably selling as first time home buyer type of programs or other programs, just getting rid of those assets. And using those funds to try to do some other development like the one that we're talking about in Estacada. So yeah, Devin's the head developer. We're going to be meeting with Matt tomorrow to take a look at the sites and just start the process.
Yeah.
And so by the next meeting, yeah, maybe we can get something on the agenda, and maybe even have Devin join us, who is the developer who knows a lot more about the process, just to talk a little bit about what that looks like.
Okay, great. So again, this group is charged with making recommendations not only regarding policy, not only regarding like rules and administrative things like fee structures, but also regarding potential partnerships and other opportunities like this with either nonprofit developers or the housing authority. So we're trying to look at all of these things as a comprehensive housing production strategy, and not just focus on rules, not just focus on policy, not just focus on partnerships. We're trying to hit it all. With that, I guess if no one else has anything pressing, I think we'll be forced to table the rest until our next meeting. I'll shoot out a doodle again to try and put something on the calendar. I'd like to meet sooner than later, just to keep the momentum going here. So it just appreciates everyone's flexibility as much as possible in trying to make yourself available. Anyone else have anything before we adjourn?
Matt, after we adjourn, I got a quick question for you. People could stay around and listen if they want, but if you don't mind doing that.
Yeah, that's no problem for me. Okay, with that, we'll adjourn at 3:57 p.m. Thank you, Sean, and for everyone's participation.
Yeah, thanks everybody for having me. It was great to join.
I think